Before I get started, I suppose, with the topic that I was given, because I have the mic, I'm going to take a little bit of liberty in just telling you things that I want to say, irregardless if it completely aligns with the topic I was given. And so I wanted to just take a few moments to go through this very, very basic model that I'm sure a lot of you have seen before. The notion that phenotype comes about through environment, and I'm going to denote that as the big E here. Think about it as contemporary group, the management effects that we apply to cattle, genetics, so the genetic merit of the animals, and then I have this little E out here. I'm going to call that residual. That's all the variation that we can't explain by known environmental effects or genetics of the animal. Okay, so that's the very basic equation. I'm going to break it down a little bit more. This G, the genetic part, comes about through really three different genetic components. A, which is additive, that's what we exploit by using EPDs. The D, which is dominance, and the I, which is epistasis, the interaction among genes. Here's why that's important. If you're a seed stock producer, your goal is to improve the A part, the additive genetics, okay, the EPD merit of your herd. If you're a commercial producer, you have the benefit of exploiting all of that. And you do so by selecting within breed, or within population, using EPDs, and then implementing a well-structured crossbreeding program to exploit the dominance and epistasis. Now, the real point I wanted to make by those first two slides is this notion of heritability, which I assume the majority of the room thinks they understand. And I'm going to submit to you that the majority of you probably don't understand it the way I'd like you to, and that's my fault. Because for too many years, maybe people like me, have talked about it in a very superficial way. Okay, we describe heritability as the fraction of phenotypic differences due to differences among animals in their additive genetic merit. Now, that's not completely true. What it really is, if I can back up, it's the phenotype that we have adjusted for known sources of environmental variation. It's that adjusted phenotype which is in the denominator of heritability. Why is that important? Because if I tell you the heritability of female fertility traits is maybe 10% or 20%, to the layperson, they think, well, that means 80 or 90% of the differences I see in fertility are due to the management things I do. And that's false. That's an incorrect understanding of heritability. Okay? If the heritability is low, it does not mean everything else is due to the management decisions you take. The other thing that's very important, and those familiar with dairy in the room would understand this quite well, is that even if a trait is lowly heritable, we can still make considerable genetic change. It may take a little bit longer, but we can still change it. All right, so that was my academic lesson for the morning. There'll be a test later on in the day, so hopefully you have good notes. Germane to the question I was given, balancing maternal and terminal, to me it starts with a breeding objective. And you may have heard this before. Some of you maybe even have one. But in my experience, most people never put pen to paper and actually write it down. It's kind of like a business plan for your breeding program. Okay? It details the desired direction of a breeding program. And assuming improved profit is the desire, that it's an economically focused breeding objective. And I think for the lion's share of people in here, you would say, yeah, profit is my objective. If that's the case, then we need to ask the question, well, does your breeding program actually lead to improved profit? So it quantifies the current state of production and really future economic situations, which the best proxy for is an average of past economic situations. So then it identifies the traits, which we call economically relevant, that lead to improved profit. And the last bullet point I have is a really important one because we're going to touch on it later, is it accounts for the timeline that I want to consider improved profit. Do I want to improve profit in a 2-year time horizon, or do I want it in a 20-year time horizon? That's a really important difference, because if I want profit in the short term, I will inherently focus on traits which are going to be measured in the short term, often at the sacrifice of traits which will be measured in the long term, right? I don't expect you to have any chance of reading this unless you are right here behind the screen. But the point I want to make is, once you form a breeding objective, the next task is to put that into action by forming a breeding system. And to do so requires knowledge of breed differences. This is a table from the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center. On an annual basis, they publish breed of sire means. That is, a sire from breed A, their offspring, compared to the average of a different breed, bulls from a different breed, right? And they publish this for growth and carcass traits. Unfortunately, though, for this audience, we don't have those same kind of estimates for female fertility traits. That said, though, we do have estimates for things that may impact your decisions if you're selecting breeds to use to create replacement females, and that's mature cow weight, right? Mature cow weight being really the best proxy we have for feed intake of the cow herd. These are breed differences all contrasted to Angus using US mark data. Importantly, these breed differences are not adjusted for differences in body condition. If we adjusted them for differences in body condition, we'd actually see a re-ranking of the breeds, okay? Meaning there are substantial breed differences for body condition as well. Now, there are numerical differences up here. What I would submit to you, though, is most of these are pretty darn close to each other. And amazingly, to some, breeds have changed quite a bit over the past several decades. And arguably, those changes have led to an erosion in breed complementarity. In other words, breeds have become more similar to each other, okay? But it's important, my point is, to know how breeds rank and compare today, not the way they compared several decades ago. So I mentioned complementarity, and I would argue that true complementarity says that I'm going to take a group of bulls who maximize growth and carcass potential and breed them to a group of commercial cows who are bred to be maternally focused. And maternally focused, I see that in bull sale ads, right? We're maternally focused. A lot of times I interpret that as an excuse for not having selected for growth and carcass, right? Maternally focused says I selected for female fertility, reduced mature cow weight, optimal lactation potential, those kinds of things, okay? But that's what true complementarity is to me. So as we think about a balancing act, the pairing of breeds allows us that balance. I would argue that this kind of thing was commonly done decades ago when exotic germplasm was first imported, maybe not so much anymore. I have a couple of theses as to why that is, the notion that one breed could do it all, or even worse, one bull can excel in all traits. Both of those, of course, false. If we think about the traits that are important, if I'm producing terminal offspring, this is my list here. The ones in blue, the majority of beef breeds have some kind of EPD for feed efficiency. A lot have some kind of residual, be it residual feed intake or residual average daily gain, and a lot have dry matter intake. But these are the things I would focus on if I'm terminally focused. And I want you to contrast that then to the list of traits that may be important if I'm creating replacement females. And it's a different list. And if we try to do both simultaneously, it becomes a long list with which I need to focus on. And if I focus on a lot of traits simultaneously, what will happen is I will make less change in any component trait than if I were to reduce the number of traits I'm focused on, okay? So that's important to consider. If I force a bull to do all of those things very well, I will make less change than if I narrow the list of traits which I focus on. There's a fairly easy breeding system, and I'm not going to go through an exhaustive list of all the breeding systems. There's actually a really nice resource in the Sire Selection Manual authored by Bob Weber, who's here towards the front, that goes through a lot of different breeding systems, but this is one I thought there was merit in pointing out for this discussion. It's a 3-breed terminal system. So I have crossbred cows that are maternally focused, and I breed to a 3rd breed of bull who's terminal, i.e. high growth, high carcass merit, and all those calves then are terminal. That's a fairly easy breeding system that maximizes maternal heterosis, individual heterosis, and allows me to strike the balance between terminal and maternal because I am not asking the same breeding decision to result in both high-quality terminal calves and high-quality maternal replacements. I would argue, though, this system is not heavily utilized in the U.S., and that's unfortunate. I'd also, it's almost out of obligation, given the nature of the meeting, mention that advanced reproductive technology, i.e. the use of sex semen, could help us exploit this as well by perhaps creating maternal replacements using female sorted semen. You could go farther then and produce terminal offspring using male sorted semen. So reducing the number of the undesirable sex, so less female or maternally oriented steer calves and fewer perhaps terminally oriented female calves, and that's through the use of sex semen. I remember Funson somewhere here years and years ago now, because I'm getting old, he hosted a meeting that really talked about how we're going to generate replacement females going forward, and I posed the question, what's the ROI on using sex semen? And somebody managed a fairly large ranch at that time in the room, commercial ranch, said, well, I don't need to calculate that because there's just no return on it. In fact, this person thought there was no return on AI to begin with. But I thought that was extremely short-sighted to not pencil out what the value proposition is even at the commercial industry level. There's a lot of tools that you can use within population. Notice I'm trying to avoid the use of the word within breed, so it could be within population to select for maternally oriented animals. So I have a couple here that are growth focused. Mature height, I'm not particularly keen on mature height because I don't think we feed height, I think we feed weight. So mature weight to me is more important. But if you think about mature cow weight, it's actually a revenue trait, right? We sell cool cows, and it's a proxy, the best proxy we have for cow feed intake. That's why we care about it. And I'd argue we probably haven't cared about it enough in terms of reducing mature cow size. Now, I'm going to do this early in the morning just because I want to be provocative and it's my general nature. What would be potentially an emerging and better proxy for cow feed intake than mature cow weight? Audience participation time. So DMI, so we have DMI predictions, those are on growing animals, right? On growing animals. And there's a positive genetic correlation, at least in the literature, between DMI and growing animals and animals fed high roughage diets, okay? What might be another one to get a proxy for feed intake on cows out there actually grazing? Milk, okay? We've got, of course, milk and beef cattle. That's maternal weaning weight. We don't milk beef cows on purpose. Something else that we don't have yet. RFI, residual feed intake. Methane. Methane output from the cows might be our best opportunity for a proxy for how much cows are actually eating. So there's real merit in that going forward. And I think it would be short-sighted to be dismissive of it. All right, that's maybe the last contentious thing I'll say, but it kind of depends on how I feel as we go through the rest of this. The other one I want to mention is scrotal circumference. I was talked some about in a panel here a couple of days ago, right? Scrotal circumference, obviously in centimeters. I have to remind my students of that when we put on our university bull sale, that we don't measure that in inches, it's in centimeters. And there's no doubt that as scrotal circumference goes up, there's literature support for average age of puberty of his daughters to go down, but it is really hard to find literature support for scrotal circumference relationship with his daughters actually getting pregnant in Bos Taurus breeds. Okay, we pushed age of puberty down quite a bit in taurine breeds, and so I would argue this is not the great proxy that, or it's not the best proxy for female fertility. Now in Indicus breeds, perhaps a bit of a different story. And the reality is we have direct measures of female fertility now. Some breeds have heifer pregnancy EPD, some have age at first calving EPD, and now all breeds have some measure of reproductive longevity, be it stayability, sustained cow fertility, or Angus's functional longevity. The reality is all of those are the same thing. They're just reported sometimes on a slightly different scale. But those are really related to the long-term success of a female, which I would argue has substantially more economic value than heifer pregnancy. Okay? So in all the economic indexes I've looked at, some measure of sustained cow fertility, always much more important than heifer pregnancy is. So if you think about selecting for females that have a greater success or chance of success in your herd, it is stayability, sustained cow fertility, or functional longevity where you should put your selection emphasis. So we have things now to select for maternally oriented replacements. And I hear a lot of times, yeah, but those things aren't very accurate. And they're less accurate than growth traits for two primary reasons. Heritability is lower, and we only measure those things on one sex. Okay, so data becomes somewhat limited. But because of genomics, we've been able to increase the accuracy substantially. This is a very simple example of how genomics works. This is a 3-generation pedigree, right? So the numbers up there show our expectation of how those animals are related. It's our expectation of how they're related. Let me ask this question. What's the relationship between you and one of your grandparents? I'm not prying, okay? I'm not trying to get in your business. What is it? 25%, okay? 25%. If there was somebody in the room that was going to give me an answer bigger than that, I just saved you from embarrassing yourself, okay? Because bigger than that would suggest inbreeding. Yeah, I'll stop there, right? So 25% on average. That's on average. The range could be 0 to 0.5. So some of you at the DNA level have a 0 relationship with one of your grandparents. And it doesn't mean there's pedigree error, okay? That could happen. That's the benefit of genomics. So this is real animal data, and it's the relationship of individuals with a grandparent using approximately 50,000 DNA markers, and you see a very nice bell-shaped curve with our expected value denoted by that vertical red bar at about 25%, and the range from about 0 to 0.5. In this, it goes a little over 0.5 because this was actually a nucleus herd where there's some degree of inbreeding. Okay? Genomics allows us to more accurately estimate the relationship among individuals, which allows us to make better use of the phenotypic data we have, which then in turn allows the accuracy of EPD to go up on very young animals. And that's illustrated by, I'll come back to that, by this notion of progeny equivalence. I don't want you to compare the columns across organizations, but what I want to point out is that's stayability, the progeny equivalent of 15 that says on a yearling animal that has not yet been exposed to females, we can have an accuracy of their stayability EPD to as if they already had 15 daughters out there in production. Okay, that's a substantial increase in accuracy. And your dairy counterpart has exploited this to the hilt. Okay, and the reason they have is because they understood this equation quite well. This is what we call the breeder's equation or key equation. It tells us how much genetic gain we expect per unit of time. In the numerator, that R is the accuracy of the selection tool we use. I is selection intensity. How choosy are we in picking the parents of the next generation? That funny circle with the BV is related to how much genetic variation there is for the trait. And that big L in the denominator is generation interval, the average age of the parents when the next generation is born. So genomics, particularly as we think about sex-limited traits, things that are maternally oriented. It allows us to increase accuracy, and if we exploit it fully, allows us to decrease generation interval. When I talk about decreasing generation interval, I'm saying using younger bulls and younger cows, okay? Which our industry doesn't do well. This benefit is mitigation of risk for commercial bull buyers. They have more confidence in what they're buying. Should lead to faster genetic progress if we fully exploit it the way we can. But there's this conundrum in our industry of confidence versus speed. And I've heard this time and time again. Yeah, but I want confidence, right? So I'm going to use that AI sire that's extremely old, or I'm going to flush that 15-year-old cow. Well, maybe you increase confidence, but you dramatically decrease the rate of genetic gain. Dramatically decrease it. And I think that's something that we need to understand as an industry, particularly if we want to improve traits that are lowly heritable. We have a lot of tools at hand to strike a balance between terminal and maternal. I'd argue we don't use them. Selection indexes developed by Lenoy Hazel from Iowa State in 1942. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, right? That was a long time ago, and we didn't really implement them at a breed-wide basis in the beef industry until the early 2000s. Pretty large technology timeline gap there. In principle, those are tools to select for increased commercial level profit and should enable a balance economically, a balance between terminal and maternal. There are a lot of these in existence in our industry. If your favorite breed isn't listed up there, that's not with malice of intent, okay? It's just, I don't know. I didn't get it on the slide, right? But I've denoted them as either terminal or what I'll call general purpose. I'm hesitant to call them maternal, general purpose. So terminal, if you use an index on that side, it says that every calf born is destined to head to the feed yard. No replacements are kept. If you keep replacements, you use an index on the right-hand side. It's no more complicated than that. Because if you keep back replacements and you use an index in the terminal list, it does not take into account anything related to female fertility. And I feel fairly confident in saying over time, mature cow weight will go up, because the emphasis on those is in post-wean gain. So indexes, an extremely valuable tool, but like any tool, you got to use it appropriately. I say that as a father of a 7-year-old son who likes to go and grab daddy's tools from the shop, right? We have to have a talk about the appropriate use of tools, because I've seen things used in ways I didn't think they could be used, right? Same thing applies to genetic selection tools. You've got to use them appropriately. I want to go through some index examples. I'm going to go through using some software that is offered through the Beef Improvement Federation. You go to the BIF website, you can find the software called iGenDec. Just in brief, what it does is it builds, using popular language today, a digital twin of the user's cow herd. Okay, what that means is the user inputs data about their cow herd, and it simulates a very large twin of that herd, such that it can go through in time and estimate the marginal economic value of making change in various traits. So the idea then, it could come up with a customized selection index. But I used it because I thought it was useful to go through some examples. I realize this is going to be hard to see in the back, but I'll take you through at a high level what I did. So I created some general purpose indexes, which assumed that steers and coal heifers were marketed through a feed yard, so retained ownership, selling on a grid-based system, and I kept back replacement heifers. And I perturbed what I'm going to call planning horizon. So planning horizon is the length of time to contemplate the economic returns and costs associated with a sire selection decision. And that's going to be important as we talk about this balancing. I also perturbed annual cow costs. So annual variable cow costs of $250 in AUM, $500 in AUM, and $750 in AUM, and I assume cows weighed 1,300 pounds on average. Now, I know somebody in the audience is saying, he doesn't know what he's talking about, thinking it only costs $250 to run a cow. I did that because I wanted to look at extreme differences, okay? I wanted to look at extreme differences. I also perturbed hot carcass weight of the calves for an average of 700, 800, and 900 pounds too. So what I'm trying to do is look at, as these changes occur, how should it change what I select on to strike an economic balance between terminal and maternal traits. So just to show you what traits were in the index, I had hot carcass weight, ribeye, fat, marbling, weaning weight direct, weaning weight maternal, yearling weight, feed intake, mature cow weight, stayability, heifer pregnancy, and both calving ease direct and calving ease maternal, because I'm asking this index to cover the spectrum of keeping replacement females and then retaining cattle through the feeding phase. So the results I'm going to show you are relative emphasis. The way to interpret that is, relatively speaking, which traits really drive my breeding objective, and in proportionality, which ones are more important. Okay, that's the way to think about relative emphasis. First result slide. So even though I had a bunch of traits in the index and in the breeding objective, I just isolated on 3 to show you. That's MWT, mature cow weight, stay, so stayability, and then HCW, which is hot carcass weight. So I chose the really revenue driver, which is hot carcass weight in this example, and then 2 things related to the cow herd. Okay, that's why I pulled them out. So as I changed the length of the planning horizon from 2 years to 10 years to 20 years, what happens? The relative emphasis of things expressed in the cow herd, like mature cow weight and stayability, increase in importance. Meaning that if I have a longer term view on profit, those traits that are expressed in the cow herd, i.e. the maternally oriented things, become much more important to me. If my view on profit is short term, then they don't matter. What matters then is the chief revenue trait, which is hot carcass weight. So as you think about your breeding objective, I highly encourage you to think about, do I want to maximize profit in the short term, or do I want to maximize it in the long term? Because it will change not only what traits you select on, but the relative importance to you. All right, this is my changing of annual cow cost here. Shouldn't be a surprise. As I changed cow costs in my assumptions, the revenue from sale calves stayed the same, so you can argue with that. But as cow costs went up, the relative emphasis on mature cow weight skyrocketed too. And the actual marginal economic value with that's negative. It says push it down, right? My point here isn't for everyone to go home and say, well, what Spangler told us is to make cows as small as we can. That's not what I'm telling you. What I'm telling you is, though, is you need to have an honest accounting for how big your cows are, what they really cost you to run, so that you understand how to appropriately consider such a trait in your selection decisions. And I've heard time and time again, well, we can't produce big fed cattle with little cows. We can produce pretty big fed cattle with cows smaller than we have now. Okay? If we appropriately use a breeding system designed for maternally oriented females and maximize growth in terminal size. The last one is the hot carcass weight example. And I see Paul in the back, and he's going to say you didn't use average weights big enough, Matt. And I agree. I don't know anymore what the right size is to project the future. But my point here is as I increased hot carcass weight, and if you assume someday in the future we might again have a discount for heavies, then this example might become even more important. But as I approached, my average approached a discount threshold, economically it says throttle back, right? The marginal economic value isn't as high as it once was. The same example could be used for any other trait which has a nonlinear relationship with revenue or profit. So think about marbling. If I push more and more cattle into prime, the marginal economic value associated with marbling, increase in marbling, goes down, right? Because there's not enough potential for added profit once I reach a certain threshold. That says that understanding on the terminal side where I sit today helps me decide how important those traits are to me in the future. So what inferences do we make from all of that? As I said before, emphasis on short-term profit at the expense of longer-term economic success can lead to substantially different traits in the index. I think most commercial cattle producers would say, I'm in this for the long haul. A lot would say, I want to transition over to the next generation. That would insinuate that you have a long-term outlook on profit. And I would just ask if your breeding decisions also have a long-term outlook on profit. I would also say these examples illustrate the incorrect definition of breeding objectives can lead to incorrect or imbalance in selection decisions. So it goes back to knowing how my cattle actually perform today to inform what the decisions need to look like going forward. If you don't do that, there's no way of striking a balance between terminal and term. And maybe some concluding thoughts. So a well-formed breeding objective sets the degree of balance that's actually required. Because your cow herds are different than your neighbors, that says that to strike some sort of balance between terminal and maternal will have a different look, because the selection decisions you make, i.e. the bulls you choose, are going to be different. Knowledge of breed differences and exploiting well-structured crossbreeding avoids the need to find balance in a single breed or a single individual. People like Bob and I have preached that for years, decades now. The people that came before us preached it, and it feels like it's kind of a failed attempt anymore, right? We don't exploit breeding systems the way our competitors and other proteins do. I understand beef isn't pork, but there's no reason why we couldn't do a better job of pairing individuals than we do today. Maternal and terminal traits have a different degree of balance, I said, depending on the planning horizon for quantifying profit. It goes back to the differences we saw between a 2-year planning horizon and a 20-year planning horizon. Okay? In 2 years, I select on hot carcass weight, carcass traits, period. If it's 20 years, I need to think about reproductive longevity, mature cow weight, etc. And balancing traits should be thought of at the herd level and not at the individual animal level. I.e., I want to strike a balance in my herd. I don't need every individual sire I bring in to strike that balance. They're a part of the puzzle. They should not be expected to be the complete picture. I've heard it said before, if your cows excel in the same traits your bulls do, you're leaving profit on the table, because you're not fully taking advantage of complementarity in a breeding system. Of course, that's meant at the commercial level. Before I wrap up, this is a QR code. So a colleague of mine, Dare Bullock from the University of Kentucky, is conducting a survey to try to get a sense for the degree of emphasis cattle producers put on different traits in their selection decisions. And so if you're so inclined, I'd encourage you to complete that survey. He has up here that there's a chance to win $100 gift cards provided by the Beef Improvement Federation. And really what DARE's objective is with the knowledge of what people are not only selecting for, but relatively speaking, what's more important to them in their selection decisions, that helps cater, if you will, educational programs with that knowledge. And so I'd encourage you to complete that survey. So with that, I think I came close to getting us back on time, despite our late start, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.